Owen Jones, Ash Sarkar, Hsiao-Hung Pai, excuse me. Hsiao-Hung Pai, excuse me. And Daniel Trilling. Yes, I'm going to turn over to Daniel in a minute. In the meantime, the fire exits are there and there. Be careful with your wine glasses when you get up at the end of the evening. And that concludes the introduction. I've been told to say follow us on Facebook and twitter.com. And good evening to anyone watching this on the live stream.
Okay, thank you everybody for coming to see this talk tonight. My name's Daniel Trilling, I'm the editor of New Humanist magazine, and I'm going to be chairing the event this evening. So, first of all, I just wanted to make a few opening remarks to give some context, and then Hsiao-Hung is going to talk about her book for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then Ash and Owen will respond, and then we'll open it up to the floor. But to set some of the wider context, in the early 1900s, an anti-immigration street movement called the British Brothers League emerged in the East End of London. Using the slogan, "England for the English," its members were involved in violent attacks on the mainly Jewish immigrants who had sought refuge in Britain at the turn of the last century. This was the first in a long line of far-right movements, from the British Union of Fascists in the 1930s, to the White Defence League in the 1950s, to the National Front and British National Party in more recent decades, to have taken to Britain's streets, usually to target people from religious or ethnic minority backgrounds. Their particular choice of target has varied, but the behaviour of each new group echoes its predecessors. Most of the time they're confined to the fringes, but at certain moments they break through to wider public consciousness, receiving support or at least sympathy from parts of the mainstream. The English Defence League, formed in Luton in 2009, claimed to be different. It presented itself as an anti-extremist group opposed to the actions of Islamic fundamentalists. Yet other aspects of its rhetoric and behaviour suggested that really the EDL wanted to encourage fear and hatred of Muslims in general. Members with profoundly racist and neo-Nazi views were quickly identified. The EDL grew rapidly, making use of online networks to draw thousands of supporters to its rallies across the country. Its spokespeople were given huge amounts of media attention and formed links with anti-Muslim movements across Europe and North America before it collapsed amid bitter internal division and challenges from anti-fascist opponents. Today, the British far right is at something of a low ebb. It is fragmented, although a few splinter groups are capable of serious violence when given the opportunity. At the same time, the fears encouraged by the EDL persist, while European governments, including our own, carry out policies that restrict the rights of migrants and of Muslim citizens. The refugee crisis, in particular, has given a new sense of purpose to far-right movements who claim to oppose what they call the Islamification of Europe. The EDL's former leader, who goes by the pseudonym Tommy Robinson, has been instrumental in the recent effort to set up a Europe-wide anti-immigration street movement under the banner of the German group Pegida. The task remains then to understand how far-right groups develop and what drives their support. Yet the whirlwind of media coverage they generate often has serious failings. On one hand, the focus often rests on the people who they target. What's wrong with this or that particular ethnic minority, for instance? Why can't they integrate into our society? On the other hand, supporters are caricatured as uneducated working-class yobs. The wider reasons for their frustrations and the role that middle-class and wealthy sections books have focused on exploiting. She's been shortlisted for the Orwell Prize and has won the Bread and Roses Award for Radical Publishing. For the past 2 years, she has immersed herself in the lives of people in the area of Luton where the EDL first began. This new book is the fruit of that research. And Hsiao-Hung is joined today by Ash Sarkar, who is an editor at Novara Media, and Owen Jones, Guardian columnist and author of the books Chavs and The Establishment. First, Hsiao-Hung is going to say a few words, then we'll have responses from the panel, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. Before I hand over, though, I just would like to say that this event is being live streamed, and it's being filmed on camera. I think people will be able to hear your questions during the Q&A part of the event, though, so if anybody has a problem with that, do tell one of the staff. And now I'm delighted to hand over to Hsiao-Hung.
You said everything. Yes, to see you here. Thank you for coming. This book project started from the personal. Racism always fascinates me and interests me, as I've been on the receiving end of it ever since I've lived in this country. And that's another book. My response was to take part in anti-racist activities. In the early days, I was involved in Anti-Nazi League when I was studying in Cardiff. And later on, when I moved to London, I got involved in the local campaign against the BNP in the 1990s, and took part in a lot of leafleting around council estates in Dagenham. And it was on those council estates it was the first time I got to hear what local people were thinking. And the conversations were always brief, but those conversations really, with some of the BNP members and supporters, really interested me. And I started out this project wanting to understand where people are coming from. What are the circumstances behind people's anger, resentment, and sometimes hatred? I focused on the EDL, not only because it was at the time the largest far-right street movement, but also because a lot of EDL's ideology seems to me resonate with racism in the mainstream. And that was very interesting to me. In the past year, we've seen the decline of the EDL, but the ideas of the group are very much out there in society. We can see them in Pegida, in the barbaric way refugees are treated in Europe, and in our media. Founders of the EDL always like to describe the movement as a patriotic working class street movement, but the sentiments and ideas behind it are always about ethnicity and class. Like EDL supporter described the movement, described the word working class, English working class. He said the English working class is a distinct ethnic group. What it says is that their allegiance lies with ethnicity and ethnic origin, not their class. And through this project, I came to see that the EDL is an ultra-nationalist street movement whose ideas are endorsed by the elite, scripted and administered by many street by the muscle of a discontented working class. And it's the people on the ground I was interested in. But how do we get to understand these people? And regarding methods, the book felt like a bit of an experiment at the beginning. They are ethical and practical problems to think about. First of all, I've always wanted to get close to the people I'm writing about. And I did believe that it was important to talk to and being involved in far-right activities. But that posed a problem. Would I be providing a platform for racist ideas if I allowed people to speak for themselves in a book? My view is that if we understand racism, we are more likely to challenge it effectively. And to overcome the problem of giving space to racist ideas, I have always tried to present a counter-argument and a lot of questioning following personal testimonies from interviewees. And throughout the book, you will also see conversations I've had with individuals and activists in Muslim and migrant communities. I was concerned about from my, but as I started, it did make me think, who is actually feeling foreign here? Who is the other, to reveal a very deep sense of alienation from to keep them feeling alienated. And ethnic identity, national identity seems the only thing they have left. They feel like outsiders, quite like the way I feel sometimes. And I want to introduce you to Darren here. He's sitting here. He's a very important interviewee in the book. And he describes the alienation and the sense of abandonment from these people. I'll read this quote because it's brilliant. It was fear that drove people there, Many family men, they want to know what future holds for their families. Then you've got other lads who are simply crying for help. A lot of them can't articulate how they feel, so let someone else speak for them. Then you have lads who never had a job. Around 30% of the EDL was made up of unemployed lads. I could see them going out looking for hope, and what is presented to them is a mirage. Their country, their nation are not within their reach. It's not theirs, but they followed it. They acted out their feelings. They followed their instinct, looking for some meaning, but they've been defeated years ago. And these people who are completely left out of processes, they are, I see, part of what we call the precariat, a globalized class structure emerging from neoliberalism, and some call it, I think, very good description, nomadic proletariat. Many of the people I've met come from these traditional labor voting families in old manufacturing working class communities, and they have fallen from this category to the category of the precariat, which is a class in itself very insecure but with no vision of where it wants to go. These people I've talked to, mainly semi-skilled, unskilled workers in casual, flexible employment, and as they have no secure occupation, they don't have they don't have industrial identity, and of course no sense of solidarity. It's the kind of the state of mind filled with anxiety, chronic uncertainty and despair, and this deep sense of alienation make it easy for people to be led by populism. They're from communities that have suffered from from manufacturing decline, much like what Owen Jones noted in his book Chavs, and Matthew Goodwin and Robert Ford wrote about in their book Revolt on the Right. Britain's manufacturing has lost 60% of its jobs in the last 35 years, as low-skilled jobs are outsourced to cheaper economies like China. Manufacturing continued to shrink under new labour. Its workforce halved during that period, and the impact on local communities is huge. It is this is the perfect breeding ground for extreme racism to take root. And where the EDL started is a case in point. Migration from used to work alongside each other. But when Vauxhall closed at the beginning of the century, things started to change. And the EDL also active in other areas that suffer the same kind of decline, like in the Midlands or the Northeast. More than 1 in 6 of all people living in the Northeast claim some form of unemployment benefit. One of the characters in the book, Andrew, came from a town, Grimsby, where decline of industries led to high youth unemployment, and he was one of those people who had to leave town to look for work in London. And these areas became strongholds for the EDL. And you have places in the southern England, like Eastleigh, I went to visit, where the decline of railway industry and closure of major industries such as Ford led to deep anger and disillusionment. Ford was many people's livelihood, the town's livelihood. And in the aftermath of job losses, I saw that in a labour club, Eastleigh Workers' Club, at least half of the members have turned to voting UKIP. And a former Ford worker said, I'll just read this bit, "I see my job goes to Turkey, paid for by the EU. Ford relocated with the money from Brussels and the British government. My dad used to work for them in the 70s. They employed nearly 3,000 men. Now it was down to 500, and just before the credit crunch, they made one shift redundant and just ran on one shift, and slowly that went too. Around 2,000 people lost jobs alongside me. People are struggling on 0 hours, and some of them are married and have families, and they can't afford a mortgage. This government loves it. I've always been a Labour voter, but since Tony Blair's New Labour, I became fed up with them. It's not a working class party anymore. The Tories are for the rich. The Liberals will sleep with anyone. We've got no one. UKIP's offering a solution at the moment." So when these former Ford workers go to look for casual jobs on the local building sites, they see Southern European workers and thought they found the answer to their misery. They blame migrant workers who are just as exploited, if not more than themselves. And this is because the government and the media have been feeding them with lies about immigration every single day. Migrant workers are not taking their jobs. They are feeling a skill shortage that is so severe and it has been there for at least 30 years. Migration has not led to fewer jobs. There are plenty of jobs out there, but not enough people with the skills to fill them. And the real problem is the companies, businesses are not willing to invest, and there's not enough apprenticeships to equip young people with the skills they need to enter the trade. For instance, Britain needs to train at least 75,000 engineers per year until 2020, but the current figure is only 22,000. Construction industry is in need of tens of thousands of plumbers and electricians, but they can't find enough workers. Young people here. The government has been lying to workers by dividing, blaming migration. These angry white people we're talking about are the left behind, who has little stake in society, and they are easily drawn into the politics of despair. But it's not inevitable that they become foot soldiers of the far right. I think people can go in either direction. The problem is whether they have alternatives.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for that fascinating presentation of...
I'm sorry about my English.
No, I think that gave us a really good sense of the ideas behind the book and what you're really focusing your attention on. I just wanted to ask you one quick follow-up question about, you mentioned the ethics of doing this kind of reporting and how your approach normally involves going quite deep. And in your previous books, you've tended to do that kind of undercover and have managed to blend in with the people that you're writing about. But here, as you say, there was an obvious...
you can't do undercover, no.
Yeah, you can't do undercover. And you were saying you were worried perhaps about risks to your own safety or abuse that you might receive. But I wondered, did you find as time went on you kind of built up a rapport or friendships in ways you weren't expecting, or did you find yourself getting on with people whose political views you were really repelled by?
I think it didn't take that long to actually, let's put it this way, when people say no to you, when you approach them and they say no to you, they don't want to talk to you, then that's that. But with people who are willing to talk to you and follow up and continue to talk to you, which is important because you have to follow their stories. For those people, then it became easy quite quickly, and you build up some kind of trust between you, and it was possible to communicate and follow up.
And now I think I'd like to hand over to Ash first of all for a response or some wider comments.
Well, I just want to say thanks so much for having me. I guess that Baroness Swati was busy. Saying that I think, for one other Muslim I can think of right now was busy. So I would like to frame my responses in 3 parts. The first thing I'd like to do is talk a bit about Islamophobia, thinking about how it works as a method of social control, how it has come to shape UK and European politics and its place in the historical development of racism. And then the second bit is what precisely do we mean when we talk about the white working class as demographic, as an identity? What are the kinds of class assumptions that are already encoded within our understanding of race? And in what ways are race discourses embedded in class composition? And then I guess I'd like to end on a potentially hopeful note and think about ways in which we might be able to reclaim some of the terrain from both the far right and from a liberal discourse which is in many ways no less racist, just has a lot more access to power and institutions that can reproduce racist structures and discourses. So just a thing about thinking there's an easy way to dismiss that and go, it's just a load of old codswallop who's trying to think of anything on the spot. We shouldn't bear thinking about it. But I actually think it's quite significant. The term Muslim does not just apply to a set of cultural and religious practices. It is a catch-all term and can be applied to any person of colour, depending on the context. Another good example of this would be the shooting of John Charles de Menezes, right? So he's in some ways of Muslim appearance and then is subject to a particular form of state violence. He's not actually Muslim though. So there's a certain inbuilt and I think strategic vagueness about what Muslim means, and then in terms of what violent structures you are then subject to. And it's worth thinking about why that is. I would say that post 9/11 in particular, but certainly within the last 5-10 years in particular, the era of what we might think of as classic scientific racism, which has its origins in 19th century racist discourses in which humans are organised into racial categories of black, Asian, white. It's not necessarily drawing to a close, but it's undergoing a process of transformation in which there is a renewed emphasis on culture, on language, on the way in which people identify themselves and assimilate into communities. And that's actually a much older form of racism, which I think goes way, way back into the 16th and the 15th centuries at least. And when you go back that far, you see that Islamophobia and anti-Semitism have these shared historical origins. I think Edward Said said that they were born of the same source and nourished at the same stream. I would say that scientific racism really reaches its zenith in the early and the mid-20th century, particularly with Nazi Germany, right? My personal argument is that with the Holocaust, you see the violence of the colonies return to Europe. You have the logic of scientific racism return to Europe, and the primary victims of that were, of course, Jewish people. And after that, when you have, I think after that you do see a return to an emphasis on culture, on there is nothing inherent about people of different races that stops them from integrating and living alongside each other. It's incompatible cultural practices. And so that gives racism this real veneer of respectability. And that's also how you can have someone like Trevor Phillips argue that, Muslims aren't like us. They will never integrate. You cannot choose to be born black. The implication is, but you choose to be Muslim. You choose to separate yourself from society in that way. My argument is that it would be wrong to assume that, one, cultural practices are somehow fair game for us to talk about, and they're not formed by the same prejudices and racist impulses as scientific racism. And two, that the way in which we think about race as a science, the way we think about phenotypic signifiers, that's not culturally constructed, but everything else is. And so I would be incredibly wary of that. I think that Islamophobia has become such an effective method of social control and also such an effective vote winner across Europe because it has managed to contain within it many different anxieties and political tensions. Well, we're not just talking about cultural assimilation, but we're also talking about migration, we're also talking about jobs, we're talking about welfare, we're talking about women's rights, in particular the way in which the language of women's rights can be mobilised in order to police and demonise certain communities. And I think we're seeing a renewed attack on Muslimness as a kind of nebulous floating signifier with the refugee crisis, right? It's the perceived incompatibility of Muslim values, in particular in relation to gender, is being used as a way to justify increasingly regressive border controls. And I think it's something we need to be really aware of. I'm aware of time, so I'm going to move on to the next bit, which is what precisely do we mean by white working class? It's something which both the left and the right take for granted, and we use it without thinking as a term. And the reason why I'm wary of this is because, one, it assumes that racial tensions only become visible and only become problematic at the level of working class communities and the very poorest of our society. It assumes that if you're middle class, if you're bourgeois, that your cosmopolitanism and your social capital means that there's no way you could be stupid enough to be racist, and that you can rub along just fine with people, ignoring that actually places like Oxbridge, these very exclusive elite places are actually a lot more racially homogenous than most working class neighbourhoods and areas, certainly a lot more homogenous than the area that I grew up, for instance. And the second is that it ignores the fact that throughout history, throughout culture, working class communities have been demonised and treated as suspects precisely because of a perceived proximity to ethnic and racial minorities. I'm thinking in particular of the way in which white working class women have been demonised and stigmatised as being sexually loose and available, and the classic cultural example of this is like Vicky Pollard with her children of many races, as if it's a bad thing to have children of different races. And the second thing is that it reproduces a narrative in which working class people in this country are presumed to be just white, whereas actually, obviously, working class people come from all backgrounds, and actually some of the most economically vulnerable people are of course people of colour. That also makes me wary of a way of making sense of the far right by framing it purely in terms of austerity, economic hardship and scarcity. Those who've been hardest hit by austerity are women of colour, who are also by far and away the most frequent targets of acts of racist violence. So what is the work that whiteness is doing when we're talking about the white working class and disenfranchisement and dispossession by austerity? I think the work that the word white is doing there is reproducing a sense of entitlement, which is saying that because we are white, we are not meant to be exploited or as hard hit by these inherently exploitative and brutal economic policies. I think in some ways we need to dash thinking about the white working class as distinct from the broader working class. We need to work on building solidarity and thinking about the fact that really when it comes to working class people being economically exploited, racism is used as a way to let the state, let the capitalist classes off the hook. And I think it's really important that we don't let them get away with that. The last thing that I want to talk about very briefly, if I've got the time, very briefly, is how do we claw back some of this terrain within like political culture, within media culture. And it's not just because I really enjoy trolling, though it is a big part of it. I think we need to reclaim the term radical Islam, right? We need to think about what it might mean. So this is my proposition for an actually radical Islam. And it takes the marginalised and the oppressed subject position of Muslims in the UK and extrapolates from them a sense of solidarity with oppressed and exploited people everywhere. So it opposes both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. It resists the opportunistic political narratives which pit marginalised communities against one another and lets the state off the hook. It unequivocally fights for the social, political and economic and sexual emancipation of all women, and it asserts women's agency and bodily autonomy, whether we choose to wear bikinis or burqas. It makes connections between the racist and violent policing of borders and the racist and violent policing of our streets. It calls for an end to deportations and to immigration detention, and it calls for an end to the mass incarceration of working class people and people of colour. And finally, I think it challenges whiteness, and by this I don't mean white people as individuals, but whiteness as a method of social control. It challenges whiteness as the phantom centre of power. It challenges the epistemic violence of colonial legacies within the academy and the restrictions placed on people of colour in regards to freedom of expression and freedom of movement. So that's my proposition for radical Islam. Please, no one call prevent.
Okay, so over to Owen.
Well, thank you. I mean, firstly, it's a really fantastic book, brilliant reportage, courageous, unflinching, gives voice to people who are generally airbrushed out of existence. I think it's a really brilliant piece of work, so congratulations. And I thought that was a very thoughtful exposition, and that was brilliant, by the way, really, really thought-provoking, and I learnt a lot from it, so thank you. And I suppose just a few thoughts, because partly I'm here to learn as much as anybody else. I mean, that issue of Islamophobia, which is extremely topical, well, it's not stopped being topical tragically for many, many years, but increasingly topical. And I think its relationship with anti-Semitism, I think, is quite striking. August Bebel, who was a German socialist, said that anti-Semitism, this was in the 19th century, was the socialism of fools. And by that he meant it would be the appropriation of leftist rhetoric, Jewish financiers and so on, combining it with anti-Semitic rhetoric. And I suppose today, partly, sometimes Islamophobia, it appears in the guise of a secularism for fools. And that's the appropriation of kind of rhetoric around secularism to justify the demonisation of Muslims wholesale in this country. And I suppose partly there's the issue obviously of the far right. And the targets of the far right, well, the far right managed to have lots of different targets at the same time, of course, but in terms of their primary targets, that's evolved quite clearly in the 1930s and before that. Of course, it was Jews, the aftermath of World War II in places like Britain, of course, those from the Caribbean, the Windrush generation and so on, people of Asian origin, and of course now, particularly since 9/11 and the so-called war on terror, the war on adjective, or no, is that a verb or an adjective, terror?
It's definitely.
Sorry, well, one of them anyway. Anyway, the war on terror since 9/11, when we've had a mass escalation of anti-Muslim prejudice. But the issue is, of course, it's in the far. We can focus on the far right, whether it be the likes of the British National Party, the English Defence League, of course, the right-wing populism of UKIP, or whether it be the National Front in France, the Swedish Democrats in Sweden, whether it be the Golden Dawn in Greece. But of course, as well as that, it contaminates not just the mainstream media. One study found that in just 1 week of the selected news articles randomly, over 90% of all coverage of Muslims in this country were negative. Whether it be the discourse, of course, the rhetoric of politicians, when, for example, Jack Straw infamously wrote an article describing a constituent who was wearing a veil and described it as a sign of separation and difference, and that unleashed a huge kind of national kind of hysteria almost of anti-Muslim prejudice. And whether it be, of course, not just that, but sections of liberalism and, of course, the left as well, which is something which we don't often talk about. Now, I think that point about appropriation I thought was really interesting, because you get that, of course, with women's rights, people who will never talk about women's rights except when Muslims are involved. And it's the same with LGBT rights, of course, as well. I'll often be told when I went to Calais, for example, the camp there, and people would respond over and over again on a daily basis, why do you want to let in people who want to throw you off the top of a building, etc. And I think that kind of, it was infamously Pim Fortuyn, who was gay, a far-right leader in the Netherlands, who justified, of course, his bigotry towards Muslims as a whole on the basis of LGBT rights. And that point about appropriation, I think, is really, really interesting. The point about working class identity, which of course you explore so well, the white working class label is just a very problematic label for the reasons you, again, so brilliantly put. Partly what happened for many years is, particularly within Labour, there was a sense of you airbrush out of existence the idea of class identity. We're all middle class now, that was the whole mantra. And then it suddenly re-emerged in the form of the white working class. And it was this racialisation of class. So people aren't defined by the normal definition of class, which is your economic relationship, your relationship with your employer, for example, but rather instead your whiteness, your relationship to immigration and multiculturalism, a sense of this was a ethnic minority like any others who were bewildered and on the wrong side of history and obsessed with multiculturalism and immigration. And of course you don't, as you say, you don't hear the white middle class, and we know middle class communities tend to be far more white than working class communities, which are more likely to be mixed. I mean, London has some of the highest levels of mixed race relationships on earth. That tends to happen not in suburbs like Richmond, but of course in places like Hackney or Newham or Tower Hamlets. So it's a very problematic term indeed, and it's stripping away the economic relationship of class. The issue though with kind of what's happened to working class identity over the last 35, 40 years is it's obviously become so much more fragmented, and this isn't to become nostalgic for a world which I wasn't part of, far from it. And, you know, this whole world of back-breaking jobs, very male-dominated, far less mixed than the world we have, of course, today. But I suppose you had communities based around steelworks and mines and factories. You don't have communities based around supermarkets and call centres. And as many people now work in call centres as work down the mines at the peak of the mining industry, work is far more transient and precarious. People tend to have more than one job in the same year, and that the nature of that work, as you talk about, whether it be 0 hours, temporary contracts, various forms of self-employment, where people don't know what work job they're having, sometimes from month to month, often stuck in a cycle of low-paid work and unemployment, and back to low-paid work again. So that sense of solidarity, that organic sense of solidarity, has really been broken down. And partly there's a longing for identity, which people often have. And Englishness is something that's kind of filled that vacuum. You know, and where I grew up in Stockport, I remember, you know, growing up, more and more you would see English flags appearing, and partly that was a sense of a need for belonging, a sense of collective identity to replace the old one, because the whole point was now everyone's supposed to aspire from the late 70s onwards to become middle class. You know, and that sense of working class pride, working class collective identity being so broken down, with a sense of aspiration meant becoming middle class, that sense of identity, there was a real crisis, and that's, I think, partly it. In terms of anti-immigration backlash, you know, it's wrong to reduce it just to economic issues, because it's just not true. But the intensity of anti-immigration backlash, of course, is economic, and that's whether it be the failure to build council housing, to replace the stock that was sold off. 5 million people now languish on social housing waiting lists in this country. The disappearance of skilled jobs, as you spoke about, the old manufacturing jobs and so on. The replacement often with quite precarious, low-paid service sector jobs, with the lack of pride often attached to those jobs. The falling wages and stagnation of wages and living standards, partly because of the severe weakening of the trade union movement and the form of globalisation we've had. But because of the failure, because the left collapsed as an organised political force in much of the world in the last 30 years, when all those changes were taking place, the answers of the far right, that your wages are falling, that you can't get a council house while the wrong people can, you know, the wrong people are competing for scarce resources, you can't get a secure job. And it wasn't because of these great forces to do with, I suppose, if we're going to, you know, use the word which I hate using, neoliberalism, but of course to do with immigrants and immigration. And that's obviously the intensity of anti-immigration backlash is fueled by that. Just finally, this is such an important book and an important discussion to have, because the issues in this book, whatever happens to the likes of the English Defence League or other groups, are not going to go away. At the moment, across the Western world, there is huge discontent, understandably, not least since the financial crisis, but before that as well, of course. And that discontent is going in one of two different directions. It's going in the direction of a kind of progressive politics, or it's going in the direction of a very reactionary, dangerous politics. You know, on the one hand it's Bernie Sanders, on the other hand it's Donald Trump. You know, on the one hand it's, whatever you think about the SNP or Scotland, the kind of inclusive civic nationalism, or the Corbyn phenomenon. On the other it's UKIP. It's the National Front in France. On the one hand it's the anti-austerity Podemos party in Spain. It's the right-wing Swedish Democrats in Sweden on the one hand, or it's Syriza in Greece. So there's a real polarisation taking place, and the danger is, if we don't get our act together, given this discontent that exists, then it will be those forces, the likes of Donald Trump or Nigel Farage or Marine Le Pen in France. They're waiting, and they're prepared, and they're organised, and they have roots, often quite deep roots at that. So unless we get our act together, and it's a mug's game predicting another economic crisis, but we haven't recovered from the last one, we haven't recovered, of course, from the legacy of deindustrialisation and everything that came with it. If there is another crash, then the question is, are we prepared or are we ready? Because they are, and that's a very dangerous moment. So we need to learn from this book. It's a warning, if nothing else, and a very eloquent warning at that, because there is a vacuum waiting to be filled. It's being filled often by the forces of fear, and unless we get our act together, that will happen. I'm confident, I'm just going to end on an optimistic note, we can build that optimistic movement. It has to be a movement that relates to people's everyday problems, everyday insecurities, rooted in people's communities. It's been done before, it can be done again. And it needs people not just to turn up to events like this, but all of us to commit to building a grassroots, bottom-up movement that can offer answers to the everyday problems and insecurities that millions of people increasingly face.
Okay, so thanks very much, Ash and Owen, for those perceptive and very wide-ranging comments there. Hsiao-Hung, do you have anything you'd like to say in response at this stage before I open it up to the audience? No? Good. Okay, we have about 20 minutes for... So does anybody...
If you buy the book on Darren...
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like to say what Owen just said there at the end. Basically, we're in Luton. There's Labour's in Luton, but we don't know them. It's open, like Owen said, for the taking. To be quite honest, I've looked Owen up, Ash up. I know Hsiao now, and I've looked Daniel up, but I don't know anybody else in this room. And really, within our community, I know everybody of all colours and religions. I mean, that's Luton. How the EDL started, the roots go, it's quite deep. But because we've got a Labour council, it doesn't necessarily go hand in hand that we think they're representing us. They're not. You tried to speak up and you just met with, you wasn't bothered before, why are you bothered now? And that was part of the bit of the kickback, you know. I don't want to use these words, but I'm using them quite a lot lately, disenfranchisement, things like that. It just makes me sound like I want to repeat these buzzwords. But Owen is right. It is there, and across Europe, I can see it. And if we don't get to know people like yourselves within towns like Luton, then you're going to lose Luton if there is another crash. I'm telling you that for a fact. It's over, really. You won't get it back.
All right, thanks, Darren, for that. I can see a few hands up there, so perhaps the lady there, first of all.
I think that national leaders are in a very delicate position when they try to talk about the people, Hsiao-Hung, that you refer to as angry white people. It's a problem of language. President Obama once tried to do this. He used the word bitter of a group of U.S. citizens. He said they are turning to their guns and their religion for solace. He infuriated people with that language. I don't know that he accomplished very much. I wonder, Hsiao-Hung, if you think he could have expressed himself better? If so, how does the national leader, one so public and so obviously distanced from these problems, express himself without causing so much anger?
I'm not quite sure I understand. I'm sorry.
Okay, so it's kind of about the sort of tone and the language with which national leaders use to talk about what's driving this kind of racist resentment. So Obama described people as bitter, and whether he could have made a statement like that in a more productive or constructive way. Is that?
I'm not quite sure. I'll answer this one. Anyone help?
It caused a terrible problem. People were furious that he used that word. That who are you? You condescending upper class person to refer to these people as obviously in a negative way, which he didn't mean to do.
You first? I mean, there's also the elephant in the room here of people being resentful because it was a black man saying this, right? So it wasn't simply about his class position, although that was a huge aspect of it. It was also about his racial identity and where that was coming from. One of the issues that I have with a framing of, I guess, like political discontent as being purely within racial terms is that it elides its like economic and its material basis, right? It's like, oh, well, you're just bitter, you're just angry. But at the same time, I mean, when whiteness throughout history has been constructed as being entitled to certain things, entitled to a certain amount of material comfort, and then that goes away because of things like deindustrialization and so on and so forth, what are you left with but anger? I don't think there's a problem in identifying that. I think there's a problem in then failing to address those issues with anything other than structural, systematic economic change. I also kind of think that, I don't know, maybe you don't get to be that upset about it when people of colour are described as swarms and as cockroaches, and when Muslims are framed as like an existential threat to Europe, America, and the Good Witch Glenda. You know, I think there's a power differential here, which isn't necessarily the one that was being described in that particular episode.
I mean, I thought those comments were pretty disastrous actually at the time, because I suppose kind of right-wing populism of the right in America is trying to tap into this idea that there's this kind of bunch of effete liberals who hate working class people and regard them as a bunch of knuckle-dragging bigots. And that kind of right-wing populism is trying to tap into that, not just in the United States, but elsewhere. And I think, you know, you get this here as, you know, this sense of working class people, a bunch of racists, bigots, homophobes. The research shows actually that, for example, in LGBT rights, working class people are more likely to be accepting than the middle class people, but that's not the way it's presented. But I worry about this a lot, and I wrote about this actually in that first book, and that was before UKIP rose in the way they did. That a savvy populist right would go, hang on a minute, you people, these bunch of lefties have nothing but contempt for people like you. They hate you, they hate what you believe, they regard you as stupid and bigoted and backward. And that is lethal if that is unchecked. And, you know, Obama, to be fair, he has won the presidency twice, but in the United States, though, you know, there's a book, What's the Matter with Kansas, people might have heard about. Kansas used to be the epicenter of American socialism and populism. It's now, I think, the most heavily Republican state there is, and I think it's one of the poorest states, if not the poorest state. It's one of the poorest states in the United States. And the right have been very good at mobilising people in the United States against their own economic interests. You get people who are desperately poor, who don't have health insurance, marching against health coverage on the basis, you know, but the left in America, or no, not the left, that's wrong. The Democrats have a lot to answer for there, because they failed. There was this kind of, you know, this very, you know, for example, in the early 60s, what they did is the Democrats cut taxes on corporations, increased taxes on middle Americans, and then fueled this sense of, well, it's you paying for social security for others, which is then racialised, i.e. for black people, and that was then used and manipulated to fuel this horrendous backlash, which the United States is still suffering from today. So I think, you know, about how you build a coalition without basically making working class people feel hated and belittled, and because you can win people over. In the United States there's a phenomenon at the moment of people who either support Trump or Bernie Sanders. Quite interesting, and that's there for the taking. But if we end up with a situation they're just dismissed out of hand forever, then Donald Trump will say, thank you very much, I'll have these people for myself. And that can't be allowed to happen.
Okay. I think someone has had their hand up for a while there.
Oh, hi, just for clarity's sake, Darren's my father, so just for clarity's sake there. So, I mean, I just wanted to tack on to kind of the end of a point that my dad said, and it kind of does tack on to a thing that Owen said as well, is that a lot of the so-called white working class do feel as though a liberal elite are ensnaring in a sense, and I, to a certain extent, have heard an undertone of it today, I believe, where we are separated based as, like you say, as a white working class or as a black working class, or black community rather than black working class. And I think that whilst it's constantly looked at as a separate entity, and the white working class are seen as a distinct group who are not listened to in the way, and I commend Xiao, she has listened to views without kind of judgment and without putting too much of an emphasis on people being bad people or good people. And I feel that my kind of question, tackling on to the end of that, is Owen said that it needs to come from the grassroots, and it needs to come from places like Luton, it needs to come from places like Stockport. And what would your view on how to get young, sort of so-called white working class, or just working class people in general, going more towards the left rather than going more towards the right when they feel as though the left has abandoned them?
Okay. Anyone?
Should we take a few? What do you think? And then, or do you want to answer?
We can
it's
do
up
that.
to you. I just worried about.
No, we'll take a couple more so people
that's
get
really
a chance.
I just didn't want to speak again. That was all.
Yeah.
I keep speaking.
So, anybody else with it? Yeah.
Thank you. When I saw the cover of your book, Angry White People, the image that's on the front of the skinhead is not necessarily the first image that would come in my mind. I think the Tory front bench would equally do. But I think the hierarchies and orders of scientific racism are only very, very, very faintly below the surface in our society, and probably in this room as well. We're all victims of it, and many of my friends, if I was to ask them, or think of them as racist, would be completely outraged by the idea. But if I asked them, is it counterintuitive for you to think that the school down the road, which is 90% Muslim, is an outstanding school, or a 90% black school is an outstanding school? They would have to think hard about that, because it is counterintuitive for them, and it's counterintuitive for them because it's so deeply ingrained in our social consciousness that the order of things means that's where people belong and that's where people don't belong. So I think it's very interesting, certainly, to understand how this works out in lower socioeconomic groups, but it's even more interesting often to see how it's working within the the actual ruling class. Thank you.
Okay, and should we take one more? Yeah.
I was wondering, you said you had no problem, or had little problem integrating or getting people to feel comfortable around you when you went to interview the angry white people. And can you tell me something that you found that was very surprising that you didn't know before after you talked to all these people? And as sort of a sub-question, how many women did you talk to, and were their positions different from the men?
Okay, do you want to answer that one first?
The EDL is very male dominated, and there are not that many people. If you go on any, you wouldn't, of course, but when I went on EDL marches, usually the majority were males. Not many women, because women were not encouraged to go on demonstrations. They are seen as Darren, correct me if I'm wrong, but I get these impressions that the men in the EDL seem to see women as some kind of burden. They don't want to look after. Yes, they don't want to have to provide protection for these women. And
a demonstration, they would have seen a woman where there would maybe be some sort of frontline conflict. They would see not every. I can't speak for everybody, but generally, probably society. Probably fitted into the mainstream norms of society as being like judging women as not being on the front line of some sort of street movement conflict. Basically, if I bring it down to basics, if a brick hit a woman on the head, they felt it hurt a lot more than if it hit a man on the head. So it's a bit immature argument, but that's the way they see it generally. That's the way it's seen.
And it's interesting because one of the EDR arguments about Muslims would be about women's position, but every time you see on the EDR demo, it's always majority men. And you look at the counter demos, you will see a mixture of men and women, Muslim women coming out as well, and that's quite interesting to see.
Okay.
I'd like to respond to this question about the failures of the left, if I may. I have a feeling that me and Owen are going to have very different responses to this. I think the reason why the left in this country the mainstream left has often failed to engage with working class people of all races is because it's predominantly made of bourgeois people. It's centred around the academy, centred around certain middle class professions, and is very bad at reaching outside of that. Yeah. Now, there are some grassroots organisations and activist groups that I see as beacons of hope in that regard, and they often organise around things like housing. They often organise around things like gentrification, police violence and deportations. I'm thinking in particular of things like Focus E15, I'm thinking of Haringey Solidarity Group, I'm thinking of Sisters Uncut, and they're incredibly racially diverse. Women are often on the front line of organising because we just get stuff done better. And they have a profound and unpretentious class analysis running through everything they do. And that's because they centre on the real material concerns of people, and they all have a method of direct action and direct disruption. What they have not done is let their energies be subsumed by electoral politics or necessarily like going on the media carousel of prioritising raising awareness as opposed to directly disrupting and intervening in things that affect them. So for me, it's a question of not just the social makeup of the left, but the way in which that social makeup has informed tactics, and I think resulted in a real failure of the political imagination. Like, that's my response to that question, but I'm not sure if...
Yeah, well, I totally agree in terms of the composition of the left, dominated by people who aren't rooted in communities, who don't speak or sound like people in those communities, who alienate people in those communities, who don't have the same priorities and needs and hopes and fears as people in those communities. Of course that's true, no question. You know, most people don't think about left or right other than sad politicos like me. They think about issues to be addressed in a convincing, coherent way, told in a language they understand that resonates with their experiences. I think the likes of, well, Focus E15 was an inspiring example of working class young women who got together and helped force an issue like housing on the agenda, which people just ignore. And, you know, that was extremely courageous and I think was a model. And I suppose I differ in, I suppose it's not either or, because obviously you need those community-based movements. I do think you have to take power as well politically, otherwise you leave the Tories in power and you're just desperately all the time trying to mitigate against the worst damage of their policies. You have to get rid of the Conservatives, otherwise you just end up with the Conservatives, unless there's a different roadmap to a different sort of society. But I don't think there is. I think you need political power. But in terms of building the support in the first place, I'd look at movements, and it does link into what you're saying, elsewhere in Greece and Spain that have managed this, and partly, you know, it's things like setting up food banks where you don't just give out food but try and organise the people receiving it, whether it be setting up private tenants associations, because there's 11 million people in private rented accommodation now. People can't get council houses, especially the new generation, can't afford their own home either, particularly in a place like London. Setting up, you know, to organise people on things like housing, on that kind of thing. Or, you know, after the riots, there was a guy I know called Simeon Brown who, in Tottenham, he organised football matches, brought local young people together, and afterwards had community figures, political figures to talk about issues affecting them in their everyday lives, because most people don't turn up to political meetings and start talking about resolutions. They've got better things to do with their lives. So making it a bit more fun and accessible, going to where people are. I'd like to see trade unions setting up community centres that bring people together in a kind of fun and accessible way. I think there's lots that can be done, which is about building in the community. But all I'd say is not either or. You've got to build grassroots movements. You've got to have political movements that can talk to people in a language they understand, that are dominated by people from those communities, who can understand from lived experience the issues that affect people. But, you know what, I don't think it's going to change unless we get rid of the Conservatives and we have a different sort of government. So it doesn't just mean then everyone just gets into knocking on doors and sticking on rosettes and trying to get elected. You've got to always have movements trying to change things, from housing to workers' rights to tax justice. But we've also got to get rid of the people in power who are imposing policies which are devastating people's lives. And until we do that, all we're doing is mitigating against the worst damage possible. And I don't want to spend or see people spending the next 50 years of their lives just trying to stop the worst impacts of the outright war on social housing, the welfare state, workers' rights, and just doing their bit to push back. I want us to build those community movements and to take power, and we're not there yet, but that's what we have to focus on doing as well.
Okay, thank you. We've got time for one more question from the floor, and then I'm going to take it back to the panellists to give their concluding remarks.
In a way, I don't know whether we've been chasing a phantom or a construct in terms of the white working class, and if you like, the political voice which will represent that, which Darren raised in terms of Luton. But a couple of historical snapshots. Engels, The Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844. There's much more in that book about the Irish than there is about the English. To go further back, we've talked about grassroots movements. Again, a possible model. The corresponding societies between Sheffield, the Sheffield Cutlers and radicals in London, a high proportion of which were African men and women. And those corresponding societies led, of course, to the foundation of unions and so on. So we're not without historical precedent. And I think also it puts into perspective any discussion about the white working class. As a grassroots movement with a political voice, it's never been white. If you look at the corresponding societies and how the trade union movement developed. As a sort of gloss on that in relation to the Labour Party, it's a fantastic book, The Making of the English Working Class, E.P. Thompson. He completely ignores that dimension. And I think it's interesting that so many people, intellectuals of the Labour Party, are so pious about that book, and yet it's got this incredible shortcoming, which is that unintentionally or not, it's like it's in coded terms, it's the making of the white working class at times. Not to do down what is so rich about that book, but I think it's something that, particularly in terms of the Labour Party and its history, and if you like, sort of lack of taking on the intrinsically hybrid nature of class, I think is a huge sort of baggage or burden that is still weighing it down in terms of being able to do anything in Luton, for example.
Okay, thank you. So, concluding remarks from the panel, perhaps we'll have Owen, then Ash, and then Hsiao-Hung.
Oh, well, I just spoke.
Or maybe you don't have any more than that's also fine.
Okay, well, no, you should be the concluding person, so maybe that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I think E.P. Thompson, what I like about making the English working class is it tries to show class as a static thing. It's about people's experiences, isn't it? It's an active process, and it's about people's, your interests as people being in collision with the interests of other people. I just thought it was quite interesting because it was trying to be less dogmatic about class. Engels' book called Stockport, the dirtiest, smokiest hole in the industrial world, the cheeky get. It was a great book because you're right. I mean, that point about the Irish, and because we forget that, because actually there's millions of people of Irish extraction. It's the biggest minority group in the country, and we forget that legacy of anti-Irish racism that existed. Which is, we still live with the consequences today in lots of places. But anyway, I don't know, just to wrap up, I think, I suppose it's just, whenever I do events like this, my plea is always that we don't just stroke our chin and talk about all the problems in the world, but we always think about what we can do concretely about it. And my view is all the problems we face are transient and temporary, can be overcome, but it does need a bit of effort and determination by people. So if at the end of this meeting we all just decide, you're probably all thinking, oh, what are you doing? Why are you patronising little git? But it's just that to throw ourselves into some local community organisation, a political part within reason, not UKIP, and a trade union, just something where we're actually organising to do something about it. And that for me is always the point of these events. We're here not just to interpret things, but we'll also think about what we can do about things.
I guess I would like to sum up by maybe pointing out that there's been a word missing from lots of our discussions. We've talked about deindustrialization. We have not talked about decolonisation. The reason why I'm always suspicious of harking back to, the 1940s, 1950s as an era of, you've got the birth of the NHS, and you had proper industrial communities. You had a proper working class culture. The resource extraction made possible is. So when we're talking about we need class solidarity, we need decent jobs for decent pay, for Spanish politics, Spanish party politics, even with Podemos, but the Spanish housing movement, the way in which it has galvanised and enfranchised working class people across the country, many of whom are undocumented migrants, spectre of deportation. Many of whom are women, many of whom have kids, and they have a dynamic, affectionate, fun method of organising that I think we could all really learn from. I think the other thing that we could always learn from is looking to, maybe pending revolution, the kinds of real material interventions that they made into people's lives, community that they addressed, and the fact that they didn't just say, hey, if someone goes to prison, we just leave them there. They prioritised prison organising, and that was never at the expense of other kinds of organising, like stuff around housing or access to education or demands for political representation either. I'm not saying hey guys, the most politically meaningful thing you could do is go home, sit by yourself and read, but I think these are really useful movements to learn from. Yeah.
Finally, fine. Okay, well, in which case it's just left to me to say thank you very much to the audience and to the panellists for a fascinating and very wide-ranging discussion, and thanks to the London Review Bookshop staff for being so accommodating. And there is one more thing that you can do after this talk, which is to buy a copy of Hsiao-Hung's excellent book. Thank you very much.
I feel like a